Welcome back to Male Revenge, where patient men settle old scores the right way. Tonight, a 62-year-old carpenter overhears his own son-in-law planning to steal the land he built, 1 acre at a time. The boy thinks an old man with sawdust on his hands is easy prey. He is about to learn what patience can do. Romans chapter 12, verse 19 says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." So pour your coffee, friend, and settle in. The table in mediation room B was made of white oak. I noticed that the moment I sat down, 40 minutes before anyone else arrived. Quarter sawn, the grain running tight and straight, the way it does when a tree has grown slowly over decades. I ran my thumb along the edge while I waited, and the wood told me what it always tells me. Be patient. The grain doesn't lie. I'd been a carpenter for 35 years. A man spends that long with wood, he stops seeing furniture and starts seeing character. Every piece of lumber has a story. The tight rings mean hard winters survived. The knots mean the tree grew around something difficult rather than through it. I had learned to read all of it. I had learned eventually to read people the same way. Preston Valentine walked through the door at 9:02, 2 minutes late, which told me he wanted to be seen arriving rather than waiting. 39 years old, Duke Law, 12 years of courtroom wins in real estate litigation. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than my first truck, and carried a leather briefcase he set down with the particular care of a man who wants you to notice the quality of what he owns. He had the kind of eyes that never quite land on you directly, always calculating the room. He saw me sitting there and stopped, just for a moment, just long enough for something to flicker across his face before the courtroom mask settled back into place. He had expected to arrive before me, to be the one already settled and in control of the space. Instead, he found a 62-year-old carpenter in a navy suit he'd bought in 2001, sitting with both hands flat on the white oak table, looking at him the way you look at a piece of lumber you've already measured twice. My daughter Sylvia came in behind him. Gray dress, I didn't recognize. Her dark hair pulled back the way her mother used to wear it, on days she needed to feel composed. She met my eyes for a second, then looked away. I didn't hold it against her. The attorneys from the Columbia firm filed in after that. 3 of them, each carrying their own versions of Preston's briefcase, each wearing their own versions of his confidence. They spread themselves along his side of the table with the practiced efficiency of people who bill by the hour and know it. My attorney, Norris Bledsoe, sat to my left. 56, Charleston born and raised, with the quiet, unshowable manner of a man who had won more cases than he could remember by saying less than people expected. He had reviewed our full file the night before. He had not looked nervous when we finished. That was enough for me. The mediator, Patricia Holt, opened the session. Preston's lead attorney, Gerald Fitch, spoke for 11 minutes without stopping. Phrases like marital estate contribution, and equitable reallocation of property interest, and good faith remediation of historical title irregularities. Each phrase designed to fill space, to make the room feel too crowded for questions. I had spent 3 months learning exactly what those phrases meant, and exactly what they didn't mean. Then Preston spoke. He addressed me directly, using my first name, with the deliberate warmth of a man who has practiced the gesture. "Walter," he said, "I know this feels adversarial. That's not my intention. This is about correcting a paperwork issue from 1987 that none of us created. We're just trying to make sure the property records reflect reality." He paused to let that settle. Then he slid a copy of their 38-page filing across the table toward me. Not toward Norris, toward me. "Do you understand what this document says?" The question carried the specific condescension of a man who has already decided the answer. I want to make sure we're all working from the same understanding. I let the document sit for a moment. I looked at it the way I look at a board before I cut it. Every word, I said. I helped write the response. Preston smiled the smile of a man who thinks he's heard a joke. Gerald Fitch did not smile. Fitch had the instincts of someone who had been in enough rooms to know when something was wrong, and something had just gone slightly wrong, and he didn't yet know what it was. Norris reached into the file box at his feet without any hurry. He lifted out a document roughly twice the thickness of Preston's 38 pages. He set it on the white oak table. The sound it made when it landed was quiet and final, the way a well-fitted door sounds when it closes completely. "We'd like to introduce Exhibit A," Norris said. The room went still. Preston's eyes dropped to the document. Then they came back up to me. For the first time since he had walked through that door, he was not calculating the room. He was reading my face. Whatever he found there made the color in his jaw go slightly wrong. Patricia Holt looked at the document, then at Norris, then at Preston. "Counsel," she said, "would you like a moment?" Preston said nothing. He was still looking at me. I kept my hands flat on the white oak table and let him look. 14 months before I sat down at that white oak table, I was in my workshop at 6 in the morning, doing what I had done most mornings for 4 decades. I was planning a board. The workshop sits at the southeast corner of my property, about 40 yards from the back of the main house. My father helped me build it the summer I turned 26, the two of us framing it out over 3 weekends with lumber I'd milled myself. The walls are board and batten cypress. The floor is packed earth with a concrete apron near the door, and the smell inside on a cool morning is something I have never been able to describe to anyone who hasn't spent time in a place like it. Sawdust and linseed oil, and the particular dry sweetness of curing wood. It smells like work that means something. I had been in there since 5:45, working a panel for a blanket chest commission. Figured walnut hand-cut dovetails. I had the hand plane out, taking long strokes, listening to the way the blade talked to the grain. Adjusting pressure, the way you adjust pressure on anything that requires patience rather than force. That was when I heard Preston's voice outside. He wasn't shouting. He was talking the way men talk when they believe they're alone, without any of the performance he usually carried. His voice came through the cypress boards with the flat clarity of sound traveling through old wood on a cold morning. I heard him the way I hear everything in that workshop. Completely. He was on the phone with someone. A lawyer, I thought, from the cadence of the conversation. The way they talked around things rather than directly at them, careful about what gets said on a line that might be recorded. "The deed from 87, Preston said. "There's language in the trust attachment that looks like a gap. It's not a real gap, but it looks like one, and that's enough to file on." A pause. He won't know how to respond. He's a carpenter, Gerald. He's never been in a courtroom in his life. By the time he finds someone competent to represent him, we'll have the motion on record, and the momentum will be ours. Another pause. "Sylvia doesn't need to understand the details. She just needs to sign where I tell her to sign. I'll handle the rest." There was more after that. Dollar figures. Timeline. A reference to the Buckhead firm that would handle the filing. I heard all of it. I stood in my workshop with sawdust on my hands and my father's plane on the bench beside me, and I heard every word my son-in-law said about how he planned to take the land I had spent 35 years building, 1 acre at a time. I stood there for 3 minutes after his voice faded. I know it was 3 minutes because I was looking at the old sessions clock my father left me, watching the minute hand move while I decided what kind of man I was going to be about this. The anger was there. It was sitting in my chest like a knot in green wood, tight and full of moisture, the kind that splits if you try to work it too fast. But anger is not a tool. It's a condition. You have to let it dry out before it's useful for anything. So I finished planing the board. By the time I set the plane down for the second time, I was not less angry, but I was cleaner about it. Focused. The way a board is focused when you've gotten the surface true. I went inside, washed my hands, poured coffee, and sat at the table where Margaret and I had eaten breakfast together for 28 years. The chair across from mine was empty, the way it had been empty for 3 years. And I felt her absence the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue. Automatic and specific, and always slightly surprising. I took a piece of paper from the drawer and drew a line down the middle. On the left side, I wrote what Preston knew about me. On the right side, I wrote what Preston did not know about me. The left column was short. 62 years old. Carpenter. No legal experience. Widower. Easy to underestimate. The right column took longer to write. When I finished, I folded the paper and put it in my shirt pocket. I looked out the kitchen window at the morning. Through the stand of loblolly pines marking the property boundary, I could see the roof line of the house next door. Elias Calhoun had lived there for 20 years. We had waved across fence lines and shared equipment and exchanged enough words to constitute a friendship without either of us ever calling it that. He was 78 years old, a retired federal judge for the Fourth Circuit, 22 years on the bench before he retired. I had never once asked Elias Calhoun for anything. I looked at his roofline for a long moment. Then I got up, poured a second cup of coffee into a travel mug, put on my jacket, and walked out the back door into the cool September morning. Walter knocked on Elias Calhoun's door at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. The air still held the night's chill, and the dew hadn't burned off the grass yet. He carried 2 mugs from his own kitchen, black for himself, 1 sugar for Elias. 40 years of the same order. Some things about a man never changed, and Walter had come to see that as a virtue. Elias answered before the second knock. He was 71, lean as river cane, white hair cropped close, with eyes that made a person feel their words were being catalogued before they finished saying them. He wore flannel with the sleeves rolled up and accepted the mug without ceremony. "Figured you'd come eventually," he said. They settled on the back porch without discussion. Elias's property backed against the same tree line as Walter's. From here, you could see the edge of the Beaumont land, the cedar fence posts Walter had set in 1989. The rise of the northeast field where the oaks thickened before the property line bent south toward the creek. Walter had always found it useful to see his own land from someone else's porch. Distance changed how a thing looked. "Preston Valentine filed an action last week," Walter said. No reason to ease into it. "Equitable reallocation. He's claiming his contributions during the marriage and my labor on the property entitle him to a proportional share." Elias drank his coffee. A mockingbird worked through 3 calls in the oak above them. "I know," Elias said. Walter looked at him. "I've been watching Preston Valentine for close to 3 years." Elias set his mug on the rail. "Not officially. Retired judges don't have official capacities. Just watching. The way you watch weather building from the southwest when you can't yet tell if it's going to turn." "What started it?" "Dale Whitmore, fire investigator out of Columbia. We crossed paths in a deposition on an unrelated matter. Afterward, he mentioned a property in Mount Pleasant, 2019 total loss. Accelerant confirmed. Case never moved forward. The owner collected $1.3 million. When Dale pulled the permit records, the owner's name wasn't on any of them, but an LLC kept appearing across subsequent filings." Elias paused. "I recognized the structure. Not the name, the layering. I retired from the bench. I did not retire from noticing things." Walter held his mug in both hands. The coffee had cooled, but he drank it anyway. Out in the field, a crow landed on one of the old fence posts and stood there, like it owned the ground beneath it. "How far does it go?" Walter asked. Elias stood without answering and went inside. Walter heard the hall closet open, then the deliberate drag of something heavy across hardwood. When Elias returned, he carried a standard banker's box and set it on the table between them with the care of a man who understood the weight of what was inside, even if that weight was only paper. The lid was held down by a rubber band faded from black to dull gray with age. "Before we open that," Elias said, sitting back down, "I want to say something, and I need you to hear it past the point of just agreeing with it." Walter set his mug down and waited. "Knowing what's in that box and using it incorrectly will damage you more than not knowing at all. The law does not weigh your intentions. It weighs your actions, the sequence of those actions, and who you bring into the process and when." His voice carried no drama. 30 years on the federal bench had made plain speech a permanent habit. If you leave here today and confront Preston, or if this reaches someone who deploys it in the wrong order, you move from wronged party to legally compromised participant. That distance is not forgiving. "I understand the distinction," Walter said. "I'm asking you to hold it where it governs your behavior, not just your vocabulary." Elias looked at him evenly. "You build for a living. You know sequence is structural. You don't set the roof before the foundation cures. The order protects everything above it. That is exactly the principle we are operating under here." "Patience has never been my problem," Walter said. Elias studied him a moment longer than comfortable. "No," he said. "That is precisely why I answered the door." The crow lifted off the fence post and disappeared into the oaks. The field went quiet. Preston filed because he believes no one has assembled a picture of his conduct across multiple transactions, Elias continued. Hartwell and Dre are capable. Their entire strategy depends on Preston's background going unexamined. They are not expecting resistance from more than one direction. "What's the first step?" Walter asked. "First, answer me honestly. Not what you want to win. What do you want this to look like when it's finished?" Walter thought about Sylvia 2 mornings ago, standing at the edge of the driveway long after Preston's car had gone, arms folded across her chest, watching the empty road. He had seen her from the workshop window and stayed where he was. Some things a person had to reach on their own. Walking out to explain it would have been about Walter's discomfort, not Sylvia's understanding. "I want Sylvia to see what Preston is," Walter said. "Not because I told her, because she found it herself. Whatever she does after that is her own decision. I won't hand her a conclusion. I want the understanding to be hers." Elias was quiet. Then he reached out, pulled the rubber band from the box, and set it aside. He did not open the lid immediately. His hand rested on top of it. "Then we do this correctly," he said. "We let Preston build his case. We let him believe he controls the timeline. We wait until he is fully committed, until there is no position left where he can claim honest misunderstanding." He lifted the lid and placed it to one side. Then we closed the door. Walter looked into the box. Folders in sequence. Photographs clipped to typed summaries. A handwritten index fixed to the inside of the lid in Elias's careful script. "Let him walk all the way through first," Elias said quietly. "Every step. Then you close it." Elias lifted the first folder from the box and placed it on the table. The tab read, "Mount Pleasant, 2019. "This is where Dale Whitmore started," Elias said. "Single-family residence, 1,700 square feet, built 1987. Total loss. The carrier paid out $1.3 million against a policy upgraded 14 months before the fire." Walter opened the folder. The first page was Dale Whitmore's investigation summary, Columbia Fire Marshal Division. Below it were photographs. Walter studied them without speaking. He had renovated enough structures to read a building's damage the way a doctor read an X-ray. The burn pattern was wrong. A fire from a single internal source spreads outward from one point. What Walter saw showed 3 separate origins: ground level near the front entrance, the base of the interior load-bearing wall, and the rear utility corridor. Accelerant, Walter said. 3 points confirmed. Dale's report recommended criminal referral. It was filed, reviewed, and closed in 11 weeks. No charges. The LLC holding the policy dissolved 4 months after settlement cleared. What LLC? Elias pointed to the bottom of the page. Coastal Meridian Properties LLC. Registered agent Preston A. Valentine. Walter set the folder down. Outside, the morning light had shifted from gray to flat gold across the northeast field. He watched it without really seeing it. There's more, Elias said. He placed a second folder on the table. Beaufort County, 2021. Then a third. Horry County, 2022. Each file followed the same structure. Property acquired below market. Policy upgraded 10 to 18 months before the event. Total loss, rapid payout. LLC dissolved within the year. In the Beaufort file, the registered agent was a woman named Carla Sims. Elias had attached a registry printout showing Sims as a paralegal at a firm that had represented Preston Valentine in 2 prior real estate closings. 8 years, Walter said. That we can document. Dale believes it goes further back, but earlier records are incomplete. 3 cases is enough to establish a behavioral pattern. That is the legal threshold. Walter picked up the Horry folder. The burn photographs were nearly identical to the first 3 origin points. Accelerant. Confirmed. Referral closed at the county level. Someone had been keeping these cases from moving forward. Why did the referrals keep closing? Walter asked. Each one went to a different county office, but every closure was signed by the same regional supervisor inside the state fire marshal's division. He retired 14 months ago. Dale filed a public records request for his personnel file 7 months ago. Still pending. Walter set the folder down with the others. 3 files in a line on the porch table between them. 8 years. 3 properties. 1 name at the center of all of it. Where does my land fit in? Walter asked. Elias reached into the box and removed the 4th folder. He held it without placing it on the table. Dale identified a 4th property, Georgetown County. The transaction isn't complete, which is why this file is thinner. But the pattern holds. LLC, Formation Policy Upgrade, Distressed Sale Acquisition. Elias placed the folder on the table, his hand resting on top of it. The Georgetown property borders a parcel under contract for mixed-use commercial development. Post-event land value would be significantly higher than what was paid for it. Walter looked at the closed folder. He needs capital, Walter said. He was thinking out loud, the way he worked through a structural problem, finding where each piece connected to the next. The claim against my land has nothing to do with the marriage. He needs to liquidate my property to fund Georgetown. Elias said nothing. He looked at Walter the way a teacher looks at a student who has finally arrived at the right answer without being told what it was. That is Dale's working theory, Elias said. Consistent with everything in front of you. Walter looked out at the northeast field. The oak Margaret had helped him plant in 1991 stood at the far edge, unchanged by any of this. 34 years in the ground. It did not know about LLCs or insurance payouts or mediation deadlines. It simply stood on the land and kept growing. What do I do now? Walter asked. Nothing yet, Elias said. I call Norris Bledsoe, property attorney out of Charleston. He left Hartwell and Dre 12 years ago, which means he knows exactly how they build a case and where the weaknesses are. Elias picked up his mug, found it empty, set it down. You go home. Work in your shop. Do not speak to Preston. Do not say a word to Sylvia, not yet. Nothing moves until Norris has reviewed the original deed. Walter stood and picked up his empty mug. Elias, he said. The old judge looked up. Thank you. Elias waved it off, one hand barely wrist high. More warmth in that small gesture than most people managed with full sentences. Walter walked home along the fence line he had built himself in 1989. Past the northeast field, past the oak. The land was quiet and exactly as it had always been. Behind him, the box sat open on the judge's porch. Everything inside it, waiting to be used at the right moment, in the right order. He had learned long ago that the material was never the problem. The problem was always the patience to let it do what it was meant to do. Norris Bledsoe's office sat on the second floor of a narrow building on East Bay Street in Charleston. Original heart pine floors, tall windows, the kind of space that had existed long enough to stop trying to prove anything. Walter arrived at 9 on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after sitting on Elias's porch. Norris was 64 shorter than Walter, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He had spent 18 years at Hartwell Dray & Associates before leaving and opening his own practice. No advertising. Clients by referral only. Elias called me Sunday, Norris said, settling behind his desk. I've reviewed the deed and all 4 pages of the attachment. He folded his hands. Before we talk strategy, I want you to understand what you actually have, not what you assume, what the document says. Go ahead, Walter said. Norris opened the folder and turned it toward Walter. Preston's claim is equitable reallocation. The argument that your labor improvements during his marriage to Sylvia created a shared interest, despite the deed remaining solely in your name. South Carolina courts have recognized labor contribution claims in limited circumstances. Hartwell filed it because they believed the deed was silent on the question. But it isn't, Walter said. No. Norris turned to the second page of the attachment. Section 7, paragraph C. Read it yourself. Walter leaned forward and read carefully. He approached legal language the way he approached a structural drawing, not for the general picture, but for the specific words that told him where the load was carried. The paragraph was 11 lines. It stated that any labor, material, or capital improvement made to the property by any party other than the named deed holder, whether related by marriage, blood, or contract, would be considered a voluntary contribution, carrying no claim of ownership interest, equity share, or right of reallocation, unless separately documented in a written instrument signed by the deed holder and filed with the county recorder. No such instrument had ever been filed. 14 months ago, Preston signed a sworn statement in a separate real estate transaction, Norris said. He affirmed under oath that he held no ownership interest in any property titled solely in another party's name. Norris slid a second document across the desk. That is Exhibit B. Combined with Section 7 as Exhibit A, his marital contribution argument is finished. He cannot claim an interest he swore on the record he did not hold. Walter sat back. He had built houses for 40 years. The worst structural failures were never visible from the outside. They hid inside the framing, a connection point that looked solid but was never engineered to carry the load placed on it. Preston had built his entire case on a connection he had already cut through himself 14 months before he filed. He didn't know about the sworn statement, Walter said. Almost certainly not. The transaction came from a different firm. No reason he would have cross-referenced it. Norris set his glasses on the desk. This ends the case at mediation, Walter, before it gets near a courtroom. What about the insurance material from Elias? Norris was careful here. That enters through Dale Whitmore independently and formally. Dale presents his findings as an investigator who has been building a case across 3 properties on his own timeline. He does not appear as your witness in the property dispute. He appears as a third party following a separate track. Norris held his pen lightly. If the fraud documentation looks like leverage, if it appears you are trading silence on a criminal matter for a favorable outcome, it poisons everything. Preston would have grounds to argue coercion, and the mediator would dismiss your position.
So Dale comes in through his own door, Walter said. Exactly. Hartwell cannot argue you weaponized it if it arrives independently. Walter nodded. He was thinking about grain, the natural direction inside a piece of wood that determined everything about how it could be worked. Cut with it, and the material cooperated. Cut against it, and you got fractures you couldn't predict or repair. Elias had told him the law had its own grain. Norris knew precisely where it ran.
How long before mediation? Walter asked.
4 months, possibly 5.
I'll file a formal response referencing Section 7 without fully exposing our position. Enough for Hartwell to know they have a problem, not enough for them to engineer around it. Let them file supplemental arguments. Let them commit deeper to a position they cannot sustain. Norris made a note. The further they go in, the less room they have when Exhibit A lands in front of the mediator.
Walter thought about what Elias had said. Let him walk all the way through the door before you close it.
Elias and Norris had clearly spoken at length before this meeting.
One more thing, Walter said.
Sylvia is going to see the insurance files eventually. There's no version of this where she doesn't.
No, Norris said. There isn't.
I need her to find it herself, not from me.
Norris considered that.
If we control the timing correctly, Sylvia sees Dale's material the same moment Preston does. Same room, same table. He paused. It will be a difficult moment for her.
I know, Walter said. But it will be hers.
He drove home along the coast road with the windows down. Salt air moved through the truck cab. The bridge over the inlet threw a long shadow across the water. He thought about his father, who had taught him that the strongest joints were never forced. They held because they were cut to fit exactly right, so that the pieces had no choice but to belong together.
Section 7, Paragraph C, 11 lines.
Sitting in the deed attachment for 34 years, unread by the man who had tried to use that same document against its owner. The wood had told him everything. He had only needed to read it. Walter saw Sylvia from his workshop window on a Thursday afternoon in late October. She was in the side yard watering the flower beds along the fence line. The same beds her mother had planted in 1998 and maintained every spring until she couldn't anymore. Sylvia had taken over without being asked, the season after Margaret passed. She never mentioned it. She simply showed up one April morning with a flat of marigolds and got down on her knees in the dirt. And Walter had watched from the same window and said nothing, because some things did not need to be commented on. He stood at his workbench with a hand plane in his grip and watched her move along the bed. The hose looped over her forearm the way Margaret used to carry it. Same motion. He did not think Sylvia was aware of that. She stopped at the far end of the bed and looked toward the house for a moment. Not at the workshop, at the back door. The look lasted only a few seconds, but Walter had spent 62 years learning to read the difference between a person looking at something and a person looking for something. Sylvia was looking for something. She did not find it. She turned back to the flowers and finished watering and coiled the hose on the ground hook the way Margaret had always done. And then she walked back to her car without coming inside. Walter set the hand plane down. He had known for some time that Sylvia was not a willing participant in what Preston was doing. The legal filing had her name attached to it in the preliminary documents, a standard procedural inclusion that Hartwell had likely recommended to strengthen the standing of the claim. But Walter had watched his daughter for 35 years, and what he saw in her was not calculation. It was confusion. The particular kind that came from living alongside someone whose behavior had slowly shifted so gradually that you couldn't identify the exact moment it had changed. Preston had not recruited Sylvia.
He had managed her. There was a difference, and it mattered. Walter had not told Norris this. Norris did not need to know it for the legal strategy to work. But Walter needed to hold it himself because it shaped everything about how he intended to handle the outcome. Winning the mediation was not the end he was working toward. Protecting Sylvia from a version of events where she felt complicit in something she had never truly chosen, that was the work. He pulled a stool out from under the bench and sat down. The workshop was quiet in the way it always got on late October afternoons, when the light came through the west-facing window at a low angle and made the sawdust on the floor look gold. He had built the workshop himself in 1994, the year after he paid off the last of the farm note. It was 20 by 30 board and batten siding, a metal roof that made good sound when it rained. He had spent more honest hours in this room than anywhere else on the property. On the shelf above the bench, behind 2 cans of finish and a coffee mug full of pencils, there was an envelope. Walter had known it was there for 3 years. He had put it there himself the week after Margaret's funeral, when he was going through the desk in the front room and found it tucked inside the back cover of her address book. His name on the front, in her handwriting. The flap unsealed, which was how Margaret had always left letters she meant to be found rather than mailed. He had not opened it. He was not sure why exactly. It was not avoidance in the way people meant when they said someone was avoiding something. It was more like the feeling he had sometimes when he finished a piece of furniture and knew it was good, a reluctance to move it out of the shop too quickly, because once it left the shop, it became something else. It belonged to the world instead of to the making of it. The letter was still his as long as he hadn't read it. Once he read it, it would become something he had to carry differently. He looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he looked back out the window at the flower bed. The hose was coiled on the hook. The marigolds were past their peak now, browning at the edges the way they did in October, but still holding color in the center. Margaret had always said you left them in the ground until the first hard frost, not before. Pulling them early was impatience dressed up as tidiness. Walter stood and walked to the shelf. He moved the coffee mug and the finish cans and picked up the envelope. It was lighter than he expected, though he didn't know why he expected it to have weight. He turned it over once in his hands, looking at his name in her script, the particular way she made the capital W, with the second peak slightly higher than the first. He carried it to the stool and sat back down. Outside, a late afternoon wind moved through the oaks along the north fence line. He could hear it in the roof, a low, steady sound, like something settling into place. He thought about Sylvia at the flower bed. He thought about the way she had looked at the back door. He thought about what Norris had said. It will be a hard moment for her, and what Walter had said back. But it will be hers. He set the envelope on the workbench in front of him, his name facing up. He did not open it yet. But he did not put it back behind the finish cans either. He left it where he could see it and went back to work. Norris called at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning in November. Walter was in the workshop, second cup of coffee on the bench beside him, working a walnut panel that had been drying since August. He picked up on the second ring. "Hartwell filed supplemental documentation yesterday afternoon," Norris said. 22 pages. I have the full package in front of me. Walter set his coffee down. What's in it? 2 arguments. The first is an expansion of the labor contribution claim they've attached. A revised valuation of your improvement work going back to 1994, commissioned from an appraiser out of Columbia. The figure they're using is $240,000 in assessed contribution value. Norris paused. The second argument is a misreading of the incorporation clause in the deed attachment. They're claiming the language in Section 7 only applies to third-party contractors, not family members. It's a narrow interpretation, and it's wrong, but it's not carelessly wrong. Someone spent time constructing it. Can they make it stick? No. The incorporation clause references any party without qualification. Family membership is not a carve-out anywhere in the document. Their appraiser's valuation is also built on an inflated baseline. They've included improvements made before the marriage began, which falls outside the scope of their own claim. Norris's voice was steady, unhurried. What they've done is deepen their commitment to a position they cannot ultimately defend, which is exactly what we wanted them to do. Walter picked up his coffee and walked to the window. The north field was pale in the early light, frost still on the grass along the fence line. He had laid that fence in the summer of 1989, working alone through July heat, setting each post by hand. 212 posts over a quarter-mile of property line. He remembered the count because he had kept it in a notebook that he still had somewhere in the house.
"What do we do with their filing?" Walter asked. "We respond formally within the required window, 14 days. My response will acknowledge their supplemental arguments and counter the incorporation clause interpretation directly. I'll cite the 3 prior South Carolina cases where identical language was applied without family member exclusion." Norris paused. "I will not mention Exhibit B yet. We hold the sworn statement until mediation. Let them continue believing the incorporation clause is their strongest obstacle."
"They don't know what's coming," Walter said. "They know something is coming. Gerald Fitch is experienced enough to feel the resistance in our responses. But knowing something is coming and knowing what it is are 2 very different positions." Norris's tone shifted slightly, the way it did when he was moving from analysis to instruction. "They've also submitted a discovery request. Financial records related to the property going back to 1987. Walter almost smiled. "Let them have it. That is my recommendation as well. 39 years of purchase records, maintenance logs, tax payments, improvement invoices, all of it. Documents your uninterrupted sole ownership and investment. Every page they receive strengthens our narrative and adds to the cost of their proceeding." Norris made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but carried the same quality. "Preston's attorneys are billing by the hour. Every document they have to review is time he is paying for." Walter turned away from the window and looked at the walnut panel on his bench. He had been planning to make it into a cabinet door. Clean lines, no ornamentation. The kind of piece that held its quality in the wood itself, rather than in anything added to it. His father had called that honest work, making something that didn't need to announce itself. "Norris," Walter said. "Their appraiser. The 240,000 figure." "Yes." "Does that valuation include the barn renovation from 2003? Norris was quiet for a moment, checking. "It does. They've listed it at $38,000 in assessed contribution value. Preston wasn't in the picture in 2003. He and Sylvia didn't marry until 2007. A longer pause this time. "Walter, that is an error in their own filing, a significant one. They have included premarital improvements in a claim that is legally bounded by the marriage period." "I know," Walter said. "I noticed it last night when I read the summary you forwarded. Why didn't you call me?" "I figured you'd find it." Norris was quiet again, and Walter could hear him turning pages. 3 of the 11 line items in their appraiser's valuation predate the marriage. The combined figure for those 3 items is $61,000. Removing them reduces their assessed contribution claim by more than 25%. He set the papers down. "This is not a minor drafting error. This is a fundamental problem with their evidentiary foundation." "I stocked the pond," Walter said. Norris did not respond immediately. Then, "I want you to explain what you mean by that." "I gave them everything they asked for in discovery. Every record going back to 1987. I knew the dates were all in there. I knew if they built their valuation carelessly, they'd include work that happened before the marriage." Walter sat back down on his stool. "A man who fishes a pond he stocked himself
isn't surprised by what he catches.
Another pause from Norris, longer than the others.
I'm going to pretend, Norris said slowly, that you told me about this strategy after the fact rather than before, because the ethical implications of the alternative are something I'd prefer not to examine too closely on a Tuesday morning.
That seems reasonable, Walter said. I'll have the formal response filed by end of week. The discovery error will be documented and submitted as a supplemental objection.
Norris paused one final time. Walter, you should have been a lawyer.
My father would have been disappointed, Walter said.
He thought it was honest work that built things. He set the phone down and picked up the hand plane. Outside, the frost was beginning to lift off the north field as the sun came up over the tree line. He ran the plane along the edge of the walnut panel, one smooth pass, and watched the thin curl of wood come away clean.
The grain was exactly where he expected it to be.
Walter did the boundary walk on the first Saturday of every month. Had done it for 30 years since the spring of 1995, when he finished paying off the second parcel, and the full 180 acres became his without condition. He walked the fence line in a particular order, north first, then east along the creek, then south, then back up the west side to the gate near the workshop. The whole circuit took about 90 minutes at a steady pace. He had never timed it deliberately. He just knew. He started at 7 that morning, before the light was fully up, with a thermos of coffee hooked to his belt and his work boots on. The grass was wet from overnight rain, and the air carried the particular weight of late November in the Carolina lowcountry. Not cold enough to be winter yet, but finished with autumn. Something in between that had no name.
The north fence line was the oldest section.
He had set these posts himself in 1989, the summer before he married Margaret, working through July heat with a post driver and a level, and no help except the occasional afternoon visit from Elias Calhoun, who would lean on the fence and offer commentary without offering labor. Walter had never minded. The commentary was usually worth something.
He stopped at the northeast corner where the fence bent south and looked out across the upper field.
The soil here was darker than the rest of the property, richer, better drained, the kind of ground that rewarded attention. He had planted winter rye along this section in October and could see the early green of it now in the low morning light. A thin, even line following the contour of the field.
He thought about the discovery filing.
Norris had submitted the formal response 4 days ago, including the supplemental objection documenting Hartwell's valuation error. 25% of their assessed contribution figure wiped out by their own careless inclusion of premarital improvement work. Walter had read the response twice and found it clean and precise, the way good work always was.
He walked on.
The east fence ran along the creek for about 400 yards before the property line moved uphill away from the water. This was the section Walter liked best, in all seasons, but particularly in late fall when the canopy had thinned enough to see the water moving below. The creek had been running on this land longer than any deed recorded it, longer than any fence marked it, longer than any family name was attached to it. That fact had always struck Walter as both humbling and clarifying.
He stopped at the old oak near the midpoint of the east line.
He had planted it with Margaret in the spring of 1991. A white oak, maybe 18 inches tall when they put it in the ground, the two of them working on a Saturday morning, while Sylvia, who was not yet born, was still months away from existing. Margaret had picked the spot herself, walking the east line twice before choosing the place where two natural drainage channels converged slightly, making the soil just deep enough to give the tree what it would need. The oak was now just over 40 feet tall. The trunk had grown to a diameter Walter could not fully reach around. It had survived 3 named storms, a drought year in 2007 that killed half the timber on the neighboring property, and 34 Carolina winters. It had not been asked to do any of that. It had simply stayed in the ground where it was planted, and done what Oaks did.
Walter put his hand on the bark and stood there for a moment. He talked to Margaret here sometimes. Not in any formal way, not bowed head, not closed eyes. Just talking, the way you talk to someone who knew you well enough that the words didn't have to be arranged carefully. He told her about the mediation, about Norris and the deed clause, about the folders on Elias's porch table. He told her about watching Sylvia water the flower beds and seeing her carry the hose the way Margaret had always carried it. He told her that the primary thing, the thing that mattered more than the land or the legal filing or any of it, was that Sylvia came out of this with her own understanding intact. Not his version of it handed to her. Hers. Margaret would have said he was being stubborn about the method. She would have been right. She usually was. He finished the coffee and reattached the thermos to his belt and walked the south line, which ran through a stand of long-leaf pine that he had never thinned and never would. Then the west line, back up to the gate. The full circuit. He was latching the gate behind him when his phone buzzed. A text from Norris. 3 words. They want expedited. Walter read it twice. Hartwell was pushing to move the mediation date earlier. He stood at the gate with the latch in his hand and considered that for a moment. An attorney who pushed for speed in a case they were losing did one of 2 things. Either they had found something new, or they were trying to force a settlement before the other side was fully prepared. Norris would not be caught unprepared. Walter knew that. And they had found nothing new because there was nothing new for them to find. Their case was built on errors they hadn't identified yet, and a foundation they didn't know had already been removed. Walter typed back 2 words. Let them. He put the phone in his pocket and walked back toward the workshop. The morning had fully arrived now, the light flat and even across the field, the winter rye green against the dark soil. 180 acres, exactly as it had always been. He went inside and picked up where he had left off on the walnut panel. Dale Whitmore drove up in a gray sedan on a Wednesday afternoon in early December, 2 weeks after Hartwell filed the expedited motion. Walter had been expecting him. Norris had arranged the meeting through Elias, keeping the connection indirect and clean. Dale was not Walter's investigator, and nothing about this visit needed to suggest otherwise. Dale was 53, medium height, with the kind of build that suggested he had been athletic once and had simply stopped without going soft. He wore a plain jacket over a collared shirt and carried a manila envelope tucked under his left arm. He shook Walter's hand at the workshop door with the firm brevity of someone who did not invest much in introductions. "Mr. Beaumont," he said. "Walter," Walter said. "Come in." They sat on opposite sides of the workbench. Walter had cleared a space and set out 2 mugs of coffee. Dale placed the envelope on the bench between them, but did not open it. He drank his coffee and looked around the workshop briefly. The tools on the pegboard. The walnut panel clamped to the side bench. The smell of linseed oil and sawdust. And then he looked at Walter with the focused attention of someone accustomed to reading rooms and the people in them. "Elias tells me you've seen the first 3 files," Dale said. "Mount Pleasant, Buford, Ori," Walter said. "Yes, then you know the pattern." Dale wrapped both hands around his mug. "What I want to walk you through today is how the pattern works mechanically. Not just what happened, but how he structured each transaction so that the fraud was difficult to prosecute. Because understanding the mechanism is what connects the 3 confirmed cases to the 4th one." "Georgetown," Walter said. "Georgetown." Dale nodded. "But before we get there, I want to make sure we're clear on something. I am not here as a witness in your property dispute. What I'm building is a separate criminal referral that will go to the State Attorney General's office when it's complete. If that referral intersects with your mediation proceeding, that intersection is coincidental and sequential. My timeline, not yours." "Understood," Walter said. Dale opened the first section of the envelope and laid 3 sheets on the bench. Each sheet was a simple timeline: property acquisition date, policy upgrade date, loss event date, payout date, LLC dissolution date. Across all 3 confirmed cases, the interval between policy upgrade and loss event ranged from 11 to 14 months. The interval between payout and LLC dissolution ranged from 3 to 5 months. 11 to 14 months, Walter said. That interval is deliberate. Most carriers flag accelerated claims policies that pay out within the first year. 14 months clears that threshold in the majority of standard residential policies. Dale tapped the timeline for Mount Pleasant. He's not operating randomly. Each transaction follows the same sequence with enough variation in the details to avoid an obvious pattern to a single investigator looking at a single case. It took me 18 months to connect all 3 because each one went through a different county office. The regional supervisor, Walter said. Dale looked at him. Elias told you. He told me the referrals were all closed by the same man. Raymond Clift, retired 14 months ago. I have his personnel file now the public records request finally came through last week. Dale's expression did not change, but something in his posture settled slightly, the way a man's does when he has been waiting a long time for a specific thing and it has finally arrived. Clift received supplemental income payments from a property management company registered in Beaufort County for 6 consecutive years. That company shares a registered agent with 2 of the LLCs Preston used in the confirmed cases. Walter set his coffee down. He was paying the supervisor, Walter said. The payments are documented. The connection between the management company and Preston's LLC network is documented. Dale gathered the 3 timeline sheets and returned them to the envelope. What I don't yet have is a direct financial link between Clift and Preston personally. A wire transfer, a signed instrument, something that puts them in direct transaction. The management company is 1 layer removed. A competent defense attorney would argue Clift had no knowledge of who ultimately controlled the LLC. Is that argument viable? In isolation, possibly. Combined with the full pattern across 3 properties and 6 years of payments, less so. Dale reached into the envelope and removed a 4th sheet. He held it without placing it on the bench. Which brings us to Georgetown. He set the sheet down. Walter looked at it. The format matched the others. Acquisition date policy, details, property description. But this one had a section at the bottom that the others lacked. A projected timeline. Acquisition already complete. Policy upgraded 7 months ago. Based on the established interval, the projected loss window opened in 4 months. He's already in motion, Walter said. The Georgetown property was acquired 8 months ago through a new LLC Tidewater Basin Holdings. The registered agent is a name I haven't seen before, which suggests he's added a layer after the Beaufort connection was compromised. Dale tapped the projected timeline. 4 months puts the window inside your mediation schedule. If the mediation resolves his financial pressure through your property, the Georgetown event may not happen. If the mediation fails, if he walks away without what he came for, the window stays open. Walter looked at the 4th sheet for a long moment. The morning light through the workshop window lay across the bench in a clean, flat line. Outside, the winter rye on the north field stood in its even rows, green and patient, doing exactly what it had been planted to do. "What do you need from me?" Walter asked. "Nothing," Dale said. "Stay out of it. Let your mediation proceed on its own track. When my referral is ready, it goes to the Attorney General, independent of anything you've done or said." He picked up his coffee and finished it. "The only thing I need is for your proceeding to stay clean." Walter nodded. Dale gathered his envelope, stood, and shook Walter's hand again at the door. The gray sedan backed out of the drive and disappeared down the road. Walter stood in the workshop doorway for a moment looking at the north field. 4 months. The same window that Norris needed to finish preparing the mediation response. The timelines were going to intersect, whether anyone planned it that way or not. Sylvia came on a Sunday afternoon in the second week of December, unannounced, which was how she had always visited before Preston. In the years before the marriage, she would simply appear at the workshop door with 2 sandwiches from the deli on Palmetto Street, or show up on a Saturday morning and spend 2 hours pulling weeds along the flower beds without saying much. Walter had always preferred that version of things. Presence without agenda, the way family was supposed to work, when it worked well. She knocked on the workshop door at 2:30. Walter was finishing a dry fit on the walnut cabinet and heard the knock without looking up. "It's open," he said. She came in and stood just inside the door, the way she had since she was a child, waiting for him to reach a stopping point rather than interrupting the work. He fit the last panel, checked the corner alignment, and set the clamp down before he turned around. She looked tired. Not the tired that came from a bad night's sleep, but the deeper kind. The kind that settled into a person's face over weeks and didn't lift with rest. She was 35 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of holding herself very still when something was wrong, as if stillness might keep the thing from becoming more real than it already was. "You want coffee?" Walter asked. "Please," she said. He poured 2 mugs from the thermos on the shelf and handed her one. She wrapped both hands around it and leaned against the side bench and looked at the walnut cabinet without really seeing it. "I found something," she said. Walter waited. "In Preston's home office. I wasn't looking for anything. I was trying to find the car insurance renewal, because mine expires in January, and he handles all of that." She paused. "There's a hanging file in his bottom desk drawer, labeled Beaumont Property. I thought it was something related to the legal filing, something Hartwell had sent him. So I opened it." "What was in it?" Walter asked. "Emails, printed out and organized by date." She set her mug on the bench beside her. "The earliest one is from March of last year. He's writing to someone at a development company I didn't recognize the name about a property acquisition timeline. He references the Beaumont acreage specifically. He uses the phrase, disposition timeline." She said the last 2 words the way a person repeated something they had been turning over in their mind for days, testing the weight of it each time. "March of last year was 2 months after Mom's funeral." Walter looked at his coffee mug. "He started planning this 2 months after your mother died," Sylvia said. It was not a question. She was saying it out loud for herself, not for Walter. Working through the arithmetic of it. "I know," Walter said. She looked at him directly for the first time since she had come in. "How long have you known?" Walter considered the honest answer. "Long enough?" "That's not an answer." "About 14 months, he said. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. The workshop held its particular afternoon silence, the low creak of the metal roof contracting in the cooling air, the faint sound of the creek moving along the east property line. "You didn't tell me," she said. "No." "Why?" Walter set his mug on the workbench and looked at her. "Because I needed you to find it yourself. Not because I handed it to you with my interpretation already attached to it." He kept his voice level, not defensive. "If I had come to you 14 months ago and told you what I knew, you would have had to decide whether to believe me or believe Preston. That's not a position I was willing to put you in." She absorbed that. He watched her work through it the way she always processed difficult things, quietly and without visible reaction until she had turned it all the way around. "There's more than the emails," she said finally. "Isn't there?" "Yes." "Is it bad?" Walter thought about Dale Whitmore's 4 timeline sheets. The 11 to 14 month interval. Raymond Clift's supplemental payments. The Georgetown property and its 4-month window. "It's serious," he said. "There are people handling the serious part who are not me.
My part is the land.
But it's connected. It's connected. Sylvia picked up her mug again and looked out the workshop window at the north field. The winter rye was holding its color even in December, a steady green against the pale afternoon sky. She stood there for a while without speaking, and Walter let the silence stay because she needed it, and because he had nothing to add that would help more than quiet.
"What do I do?" she asked.
"Nothing yet," Walter said. "There's a mediation date set. When we're in that room, everything that needs to come forward will come forward. You will see at the same time everyone else does." He paused. "What I'm asking you to do right now is wait 10 days before you say or do anything. Don't confront Preston. Don't move anything out of the house. Don't change your behavior in any way that tells him you've seen that folder."
10 days, she said. 10 days.
She looked at him steadily. He had always thought she had gotten her mother's patience as well as her mother's eyes, and he was relying on both now.
"Okay," she said.
She finished her coffee and set the mug on the bench and looked at the walnut cabinet for a real moment this time, actually seeing it.
"That's good work,"
she said quietly. "It's getting there," Walter said. She left the way she had arrived, without ceremony, walking back across the yard toward her car. Walter watched her from the workshop doorway until she turned out of the drive. Then he went back to the cabinet and picked up where he had left off. Norris called on a Monday morning, 6 days after Sylvia's visit to the workshop. Walter was at the kitchen table, with the deed attachment open in front of him, reading Section 7 for what was probably the 12th time. Not because he needed to. He had the language memorized by now. But because there was something steadying about returning to the document itself. The source. The thing that had been sitting in the county recorder's office for 34 years, patient and unambiguous, waiting for someone to read it carefully enough. "They filed an amendment to the complaint," Norris said. Walter closed the folder. "What kind of amendment?" "Preston has added Sylvia as a co-plaintiff." The kitchen was quiet. Through the window above the sink, Walter could see the north field, the winter rye still green in the flat December light. He looked at it for a moment without speaking. "Explain that," he said. "Hartwell filed a motion to amend the original complaint, naming Sylvia Valentine as a co-plaintiff in the equitable reallocation claim. The legal argument is that as Preston's spouse, Sylvia has an independent standing interest in any marital property determination." Norris's voice was measured, but Walter could hear the precision in it, the careful tone of a man delivering news he knew would land hard. "It expands the claim. It also puts Sylvia in a legally exposed position she did not choose and almost certainly does not know about." "He filed it without telling her," Walter said. "That would be my assumption, yes. Hartwell would have advised him that spousal co-plaintiff status strengthens the standing of the claim, regardless of whether the co-plaintiff is actively participating. From a purely tactical standpoint, it is a sound move." Walter stood up from the table and walked to the window. The rye in the north field moved slightly in the morning wind, a slow, even ripple across the rows. He had planted it in October, broadcast by hand along the furrows he had turned himself. Routine work. The kind of work that did not require thought and gave the mind room to move. "Does she have to respond?" Walter asked. "She will receive formal notice of the amendment within the week. At that point, she has several options. She can accept the co-plaintiff designation, she can file to be removed, or she can retain her own counsel and determine her position independently." Norris paused. "If she retains independent counsel and moves to withdraw from the complaint, it significantly weakens Preston's standing. He loses the spousal interest argument entirely." "She doesn't know about this yet," Walter said. "No. And she found Preston's folder 6 days ago. She agreed to wait 10 days before doing anything." "Walter," Norris's voice shifted slightly, "I understand what you've been trying to do for Sylvia throughout this process. I respect it.
but she is now a named party in a legal proceeding without her knowledge or consent. The calculation has changed.
Walter looked at the field.
He thought about what he had told Sylvia in the workshop. I needed you to find it yourself. He had meant that fully when he said it. He still meant it. But Norris was right that the ground had shifted. Being a named co-plaintiff without knowledge was different from discovering a folder in a desk drawer. One was a private revelation. The other was a legal exposure with a timeline attached.
I'll call her today, Walter said.
Good. When you do, I'd recommend telling her to retain separate counsel before she responds to the notice. I can give you 2 names attorneys she could call who are not connected to either side of this proceeding.
All right.
There's one more thing, Norris said. The amendment also includes a revised discovery request. They want Sylvia's personal financial records going back 5 years, bank statements, investment accounts, any property interest she may hold independently.
Walter's hand tightened slightly on the phone.
They're using her as a pressure instrument, he said.
Yes.
The financial records request is designed to make her participation costly and uncomfortable. If she feels the burden of discovery, she may be less inclined to withdraw and more inclined to go along with whatever Preston needs from the mediation. Norris let that sit for a moment. It is not a subtle move, but it is effective against someone who doesn't understand what's happening.
Sylvia will understand, Walter said.
Once she knows.
That is my assumption as well.
A brief pause. Walter, we are 1 week from mediation. The amendment does not change our core position. Exhibit A and Exhibit B are unaffected by Sylvia's co-plaintiff status. What it does is add an emotional variable to the room that we need to account for.
I'll handle the emotional variable, Walter said.
I know you will. Norris's tone carried something that was not quite warmth, but was close to it. The particular quality of a professional who had learned over time that some clients could be trusted to do exactly what they said. I'll have the formal response to the amendment ready by Wednesday. In the meantime, call Sylvia.
Walter said he would and ended the call.
He stood at the kitchen window for another minute, looking at the north field. The winter rye held its color in the gray December light, steady and unhurried, growing the way it had been planted to grow. He thought about Preston sitting across from Hartwell and Dre, agreeing to put his wife's name on a legal document without her knowledge. Using her, the way he had used everything else, as material, as leverage, as something to be positioned and deployed.
Walter picked up his phone and dialed Sylvia's number.
She answered on the second ring. I need you to come to the farm, he said. Today, if you can. There's something you need to know before it arrives in your mailbox. Walter woke at 3:40 in the morning and lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling. The bedroom was dark, and the house was quiet in the particular way it got in December. A deep, settled silence that was different from the silence of other seasons. Summer had insects and night birds. Autumn had wind in the tree line. December had nothing. Just the house holding its breath around him. He had not set an alarm. He rarely needed one. His body had always known when there was work to be done. He dressed without turning on the light. Work pants, flannel shirt. The wool vest Margaret had given him the Christmas before she got sick. And walked down the hall to the kitchen. He made coffee, poured it into the thermos, and went out to the workshop. The mediation was scheduled for 9 o'clock. He had 5 hours. The walnut cabinet was finished. He had completed the final fitting 3 days ago, applied 2 coats of oil finish, and set it against the east wall of the workshop, where it would stay until he decided where it belonged. It was a good piece, clean joinery, tight corners. The figure in the walnut panels doing the work that ornamentation would have cluttered. His father had called that kind of restraint the hardest skill to learn. Any man could add. Knowing what to leave out took time. Walter unclamped the small panel from the side bench. He had been working on it separately for the past 2 weeks apiece, without a designated purpose, which was how some of his best work started. black walnut quarter sawn, with a grain pattern that ran straight and even from one end to the other. He had been hand-planing it in stages, taking thin passes and letting the wood rest between sessions. This morning, he wanted to finish it. He poured coffee and picked up the hand plane.
His father had taught him to plane by feel as much as by sight. You learned to read the resistance through the handle when the wood pushed back. It was telling you something. Too much downward pressure, wrong angle grain running against you. A good pass felt almost effortless. The tool did the work when you were working correctly and fought you when you weren't. His father had said that was true of most things worth doing. Walter thought about what Elias had told him 14 months ago on the back porch. The order protects the structure. He had carried that through everything that followed, every conversation with Norris, every document he reviewed, every decision about what to say to Sylvia and when. The order, the sequence. Not forcing the outcome before the foundation was ready to hold it. He thought about Norris, who would be in his office on East Bay Street right now, or awake at home, reviewing his notes. Norris had filed the formal response to the amendment on Wednesday, as promised. He had submitted the supplemental objection to Hartwell's valuation error the same day. Everything that needed to be in place was in place. He thought about Dale Whitmore, who had called 3 days ago to confirm that his referral to the Attorney General's office was complete and would be submitted independent of whatever happened in mediation. Dale had not asked Walter anything. He had simply called to confirm the timeline. Professional courtesy between two men working parallel tracks toward a point of intersection. He thought about Sylvia, who had retained her own attorney, a woman named Catherine Marsh out of Mount Pleasant, one of the two names Norris had provided. Catherine had filed the motion to remove Sylvia as co-plaintiff on Friday. It would not be resolved before mediation, but its existence on the record changed the dynamic in the room. Preston would see it. Hartwell would see it. The withdrawal of spousal standing, even in motion form, sent a message that did not require explanation. Walter made 3 more passes with the plane and stopped to examine the surface in the light. The figure was coming up clean, the grain running uninterrupted from one end of the panel to the other. He ran his thumb along it and felt the smoothness that meant the wood had given up everything it was going to give. There was nothing left to take away. He set the plane down. He had been in difficult rooms before. Not mediation rooms. He had no experience with those specifically. But rooms where something important was being decided, and the people in them were not all working toward the same outcome. He had been in rooms with building inspectors who had made up their minds before they arrived. Rooms with contractors who believed a larger company could outlast a smaller one simply by extending the dispute. He had learned in those rooms that the man who understood the material better than anyone else in the space had an advantage that did not announce itself and did not need to. He knew the deed better than Gerald Fitch. He knew the property better than any appraiser Hartwell had commissioned. He knew the fraud pattern better than Preston believed anyone could know it. And he knew his daughter well enough to trust that she would hold herself together in that room when it mattered. At 8:15, he washed his hands at the workshop sink, changed his shirt, and put on the jacket he had hung on the door peg the night before. He poured the last of the coffee and stood in the workshop doorway for a moment, looking out at the farm in the early morning light. 180 acres. Exactly as it had always been. He locked the workshop and walked to his truck. Mediation Room B was on the 3rd floor of a building on Broad Street in Charleston, 4 blocks from the waterfront. The room had a long rectangular table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard on the north wall, and windows that looked out over the rooftops toward the harbor. Walter arrived at 8:20 and sat in the chair Norris indicated, left side of the table, facing the door. Norris set his briefcase on the table and opened it without ceremony. He had the organized stillness of a man who had been in rooms like this many times and had stopped finding them remarkable.
That quality alone Walter thought was worth whatever Norris charged.
Patricia Holt arrived at 8:40 and introduced herself the mediator, late 50s, with the careful neutrality of someone trained to hold a room without tipping it. She reviewed the procedural ground rules in a tone that suggested she had said the same words several hundred times and still meant them. Preston's team arrived at 8:55. Gerald Fitch came first, followed by a younger associate Walter had not seen before. And then Preston. And then, a half step behind, as if she had not fully decided until the last moment to come through the door, Sylvia. She sat at the far end of her side of the table, one seat removed from Preston, and did not look at Walter when she came in. He did not try to catch her eye. She was where she needed to be, and she would do what she needed to do. He trusted that. Patricia Holt called the session to order at 9 o'clock exactly. Gerald Fitch opened. His presentation was polished and deliberate, the practiced confidence of an attorney who had made the same argument in different rooms many times. He outlined the equitable reallocation claim, referenced the revised valuation figures, and emphasized the spousal standing component. He spoke for 11 minutes without notes. Walter listened without expression and watched Fitch's hands, which moved precisely and always returned to the same resting position on the table in front of him. A man who had rehearsed this. When Fitch finished, Patricia Holt turned to Norris. Norris did not stand. He opened the folder in front of him, removed 2 documents, and placed them flat on the table. He slid the first across to Patricia Holt and set a copy in front of Gerald Fitch. Exhibit A, Norris said. Section 7, Paragraph C of the deed attachment. Recorded with the Charleston County Recorder's Office on March 14, 1991. I'd ask that everyone take a moment to read the highlighted language. The room was quiet while they read. Walter watched Fitch's face as his eyes moved down the page. The expression did not change dramatically. Fitch was too experienced for that. But something shifted in the area around his eyes. A small recalibration. The look of a man who had just found a load-bearing wall where the drawings had shown open space. Fitch read the paragraph twice. Then he set the document flat on the table and looked at his associate. The associate had no expression at all, which told Walter more than an expression would have. The language is unambiguous, Norris said. Any labor material or capital improvement made by any party other than the named deed holder carries no claim of ownership interest or right of reallocation unless separately documented in a written instrument filed with the county recorder. No such instrument exists. The county recorder's office confirmed that in writing on December 18th, which I have as a supporting exhibit if it's needed. Fitch looked up. The incorporation clause has been addressed in our formal response filed December 10th. Norris did not raise his voice or accelerate his pace. The clause contains no family member exclusion. 3 prior South Carolina cases apply identical language without such exclusion, all cited in the response. He paused 1 beat. Exhibit B. He slid the second document across to Patricia Holt and placed a copy in front of Fitch. A sworn statement executed by Preston Valentine 14 months prior to the filing of this complaint. In it, Mr. Valentine affirms under oath that he holds no ownership interest in any property titled solely in another party's name. Norris folded his hands on the table. The sworn statement and Section 7 together eliminate the legal foundation of the equitable reallocation claim. The room was quiet. Walter looked at Preston for the first time since the session began. Preston was looking at Exhibit B. His right hand was flat on the table, and his left hand was in his lap, and his jaw had the particular set of a man who was working very hard to appear less affected than he was. Walter had seen that expression on building inspectors who had arrived expecting to find a violation and hadn't. The effort required to maintain composure when the ground shifted was visible if you knew where to look. Fitch requested a recess. Patricia Holt granted 15 minutes. The Hartwell team moved to the far corner of the room and spoke in low voices. Walter stayed in his seat. Norris poured water from the pitcher on the table and said nothing. Across the table, Sylvia was looking at Exhibit B. Not at Preston, at the document itself. Walter watched her read the sworn statement, the same careful reading she had given to the emails in Preston's folder 2 weeks ago. Her hands were flat on the table. Her face was still. She turned the page over, read the signature block, and set it down. When she looked up, she did not look at Preston. She looked at Walter. Her expression held something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, the particular look of a person who has finished doing the arithmetic and arrived at a number they had hoped not to reach. Walter held her gaze and gave her the smallest nod he had. The recess ended. Gerald Fitch announced that the marital property claim was being withdrawn. The team was pivoting to an adverse possession argument regarding the northeast section of the property. Norris uncapped his pen. "Of course they are," he said quietly, and reached for the next folder. Gerald Fitch presented the adverse possession argument in 12 minutes. The claim was straightforward on its surface, that Preston Valentine had maintained and used the northeast section of the Beaumont property continuously for a period exceeding 10 years, establishing a legal right to that portion of the land under South Carolina's adverse possession statute. Fitch cited 3 case precedents, referenced the revised appraisal, and concluded with a survey map of the northeast section that his associate pinned to the whiteboard behind him. Walter looked at the survey map. The northeast section was 41 acres. It included the creek frontage, the longleaf pine stand, and the oak. He looked at Norris. Norris was already opening the second folder. "Exhibit C," Norris said, and began placing photographs on the table in a single row. 12 photographs, each one dated in the lower right corner, each one taken from approximately the same position, standing at the east fence line, facing west, with the oak tree centered in the frame. The earliest photograph was dated April 1991. The oak was a sapling, maybe 20 inches tall, staked with a wooden post to keep it upright in its first year. Margaret was in the photograph, kneeling beside it with a trowel in her hand, squinting slightly against the morning sun. The most recent was dated November of the current year. The oak was 40 feet tall. 33 years of photographic documentation of a tree planted by the deed holder and his wife on the eastern boundary of the property, Norris said. Each photograph corresponds to an entry in the property maintenance log, copies of which are included as a supporting exhibit. The log documents monthly boundary inspections, fence maintenance, and grounds management from 1991 to present. Fitch looked at the photographs. His associate looked at the photographs. Preston looked at them too, and Walter watched him look at the photograph of Margaret, the 1991 one, with her kneeling in the spring dirt beside the sapling, and saw something cross his face that was too quick to name. Adverse possession requires that use be hostile, actual, open, exclusive, and continuous, Norris continued. The photographic and maintenance record establishes that the deed holder has exercised open, continuous, and exclusive dominion over the northeast section without interruption for 34 years. There is no period in that record during which Mr. Valentine's use of the section could be characterized as exclusive or uncontested. Patricia Holt made a note. Fitch conferred briefly with his associate. When he looked up, his voice had the careful evenness of a man adjusting his footing. The maintenance log is self-reported documentation, submitted with corresponding dated receipts for materials, county tax records showing continuous assessment under the deed holder's name, and 3 signed statements from neighboring property owners attesting to Walter Beaumont's uninterrupted management of the section. Norris set the supporting exhibits on the table in a neat stack. The log is corroborated at every material point. The adverse possession argument had taken 12 minutes to present. It took Norris 9 minutes to dismantle it. Patricia Holt removed her glasses and looked at the Hartwell side of the table. Mr. Fitch, do you have additional arguments to present? Or would your team benefit from a longer recess to reassess your position? Before Fitch could answer, the door to Mediation Room B opened. Dale Whitmore came in. He was dressed the same way he had been at the workshop. Plain jacket, collared shirt, and he carried the same manila envelope under his left arm. He did not apologize for the interruption. He introduced himself to Patricia Holt, stated his name and professional capacity, and handed her a document. "I'm a fire investigator with the Columbia Fire Marshal Division," Dale said. "I have a formal referral pending with the State Attorney General's office regarding a pattern of insurance fraud across 3 properties in South Carolina between 2019 and 2022. One of the parties named in that referral is Preston Valentine." He placed a second document on the table in front of Patricia Holt. "This is a summary of the documented pattern. I'm making the mediator aware of this referral because one of the properties currently under preliminary review in connection with the same pattern is located in Georgetown County and involves financial transactions directly related to the present proceeding." The room was very quiet. Walter looked at his hands on the table in front of him. Fitch stood. "This is highly irregular." "Mr. Fitch." Patricia Holt's voice did not rise, but it stopped him completely. She looked at the document Dale had placed before her and read it without hurry. The room waited. Preston had not moved. His right hand was still flat on the table. His left was in his lap. He was looking at the whiteboard, the survey map of the northeast section still pinned to it, and his expression had passed through the careful composure of earlier and arrived somewhere else entirely. The somewhere else that had no performance left in it. Walter looked at Sylvia. She was looking at the summary document that Dale had placed on the table. Her copy had slid within reach, and she had pulled it toward her without appearing to decide to. She was reading it the way she had read the sworn statement, methodically, without visible reaction, turning each page as she finished it. She reached the 3rd page. Walter saw her stop. He knew what was on the 3rd page. The Mount Pleasant photographs, the burn pattern, the LLC name, Coastal Meridian Properties, LLC, registered agent, Preston A. Valentine. Sylvia set the document flat on the table. She did not look at Preston. She looked at the window, the harbor visible in the distance, beyond the rooftops, flat and gray in the winter light. She sat with whatever she had just finished reading for a long moment, very still, in the way her mother had always gone still when something had become undeniably real. Then she pushed her chair back from the table and stood up. The room watched her. She looked at Patricia Holt. "I'd like to formally state for the record," she said, her voice steady, "that I am withdrawing as co-plaintiff in this proceeding, effective immediately." The room held its silence for a full 3 seconds after Sylvia spoke. Patricia Holt wrote something on her notepad. Dale Whitmore stood near the door with his envelope under his arm and his expression unchanged. Norris uncapped his pen and made a note without looking up. The Hartwell associate looked at Gerald Fitch. Gerald Fitch looked at Preston. Preston looked at Sylvia. "Sylvia," he said, "don't." Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It had the particular quality of something that had been held under pressure for a long time and had finally found the precise amount of space it needed to exist. One word. Flat and final and without any opening in it for negotiation. Preston closed his mouth. Sylvia remained standing. She had both hands on the back of her chair, not gripping it, just resting, the way a person stands when they have made a decision, and the decision has made them steadier rather than less. She looked at Patricia Holt. "For the record," Sylvia said, "I was added as co-plaintiff to this complaint without my knowledge or consent. I became aware of the amendment through my own attorney. I have retained independent counsel Catherine Marsh of Mount Pleasant, and a motion to remove me from this complaint was filed on December 20th. She paused. "I am stating my withdrawal verbally,
and on the record today to make my position unambiguous."
Patricia Holt nodded.
"The record will reflect the verbal withdrawal. Ms. Marsh's motion remains pending and will be addressed through the appropriate procedural channel."
"Thank you," Sylvia said.
She did not sit back down. She turned and looked at Preston directly for the first time since entering the room. Walter watched her do it, the way she squared herself toward him, shoulders level, chin up. The same posture Margaret had used when something needed to be said, without apology and without excess.
"I found your folder," she said. "The one in your desk. Beaumont property. I read the emails."
She kept her voice even, not cold even. There was a difference, and it carried its own weight. "I know when you started planning this. I know what the disposition timeline means. And I've just read what Mr. Whitmore put on this table." She glanced briefly at the document still in front of her chair. "I don't have anything else to say to you in this room."
She picked up her bag from the floor beside her chair.
Preston's composure had been architectural constructed carefully and maintained through the morning by force of habit and professional necessity. What Walter saw now was what happened when a structure lost its load-bearing support. Not a collapse exactly, a settling. The kind that happened after the thing holding everything up was quietly removed. "Sylvia," Preston said again. His voice had changed. The precision was gone from it. She did not turn around. She walked to where Walter was sitting and stopped beside his chair. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder, one hand a few seconds. The same gesture he had made at her school performances when she was 12 years old and had done something she was proud of and looked to him in the audience for confirmation. He put his hand over hers for a moment. Then she walked to the door and left the room. Walter turned back to the table. Patricia Holt had removed her glasses and was looking at the Hartwell side with the expression of a mediator who had seen proceedings deteriorate before and had developed a clear protocol for what came next. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "given the developments of the last 20 minutes, I'm going to recommend a 30-minute recess. I'd also like to note for the record that the material presented by Mr. Whitmore constitutes a matter of significant legal gravity that extends beyond the scope of this mediation. I will be recommending a referral of that material to the appropriate state authority at the conclusion of this session." Fitch nodded. He was already leaning toward his associate, speaking quietly. The associate was writing quickly. Preston had not moved. His right hand was still flat on the table. His left was in his lap. He was looking at the space Sylvia had occupied her empty chair, the document still lying in front of it, with the expression of a man taking inventory of a situation that had moved decisively beyond his management. Dale Whitmore crossed the room and spoke briefly to Patricia Holt in a voice Walter could not hear. She nodded and made a note. Dale did not look at Preston. He looked at Walter once, a brief, direct look that carried nothing personal, just the acknowledgement of two men whose parallel tracks had converged at the point they were always going to converge. And then he left the room, the same way he had entered it, without ceremony, without announcement, the envelope still under his arm. Norris turned to Walter during the recess. "The complaint is effectively over," he said quietly. "The marital claim is withdrawn. The adverse possession claim has no evidentiary foundation that survives what we submitted this morning. Patricia Holt will not allow this proceeding to continue in its current form." He paused. "There may be an attempt at a negotiated settlement on some minor boundary question, but Hartwell has nothing left to negotiate with." "I know," Walter said. "How are you doing?" Walter looked at Sylvia's empty chair, at the document still lying in front of it, at the photograph of Margaret, the 1991 which Norris had not retrieved yet, still on the table among the other exhibits. "I'm all right," he said, and he meant it. Not in the way a man said it to end a conversation, in the way a man said it when the thing he had been holding carefully for 14 months had finally been set down in the right place by the right hands at the right time.
Patricia Holt called the session back to order. The session ended at 12:40. Patricia Holt dismissed the proceeding with the measured finality of someone closing a door that had been left open too long. She confirmed the formal dismissal of the equitable reallocation claim, noted Sylvia's withdrawal on the record, and stated that she would be forwarding Dale Whitmore's material to the State Attorney General's office by end of business. Gerald Fitch accepted the dismissal without argument. His associate packed the Hartwell files with the careful efficiency of someone who wanted to be somewhere else as quickly as possible. Preston did not move immediately. He sat at the table while his attorneys packed around him, looking at the whiteboard, where the survey map of the northeast section was still pinned. Someone would have to take it down. Walter suspected it would be the associate. Walter stood, buttoned his jacket, and nodded to Norris. "I'll be a few minutes," he said. Norris looked at him with the steady attention of a man assessing a variable he had not fully accounted for. "Walter." "5 minutes," Walter said. "No more." He walked out of mediation room B and stood in the hallway. The building was quiet at this hour. Other offices closed. The corridor empty, except for the low hum of the elevator at the far end. He waited. Preston came out 3 minutes later. He stopped when he saw Walter standing there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Preston looked older than he had in the mediation room, the constructed composure fully gone, now replaced by something that had no performance left in it. He was 44 years old, and he looked it in a way he hadn't 2 hours ago. "I don't have anything to say to you," Preston said. "That's fine," Walter said. "I have something to say to you." Preston's jaw tightened, but he stayed where he was. Down the hall, the elevator hummed. Somewhere below them, a door opened and closed. "I know about Georgetown," Walter said. "Tidewater Basin Holdings. The policy upgrade 7 months ago. The projected window." He kept his voice level, not quiet, not raised, simply the voice he used when he was explaining something that needed to be understood clearly the first time. "Dale Whitmore's referral is complete and submitted. What happens with Georgetown is no longer in either of our hands." Preston said nothing. "What is still in your hands," Walter continued, "is how the next 30 days go. Not for me, for Sylvia." He let that sit for a moment. "She is going to need you to move through the divorce without making it harder than it already is. No contested assets, no delay tactics, no additional filings designed to extend her exposure." He paused. "In exchange for that, I will tell you one thing I have not told Dale Whitmore yet." Preston looked at him. Something shifted in his expression, the first genuine attention Walter had seen from him all morning. Not the managed attention of the mediation room. Actual attention. "The Georgetown property," Walter said. "The neighboring parcel under commercial development contract. The developer has been in contact with me directly for the past 6 weeks regarding the Beaumont acreage. They need a corridor access agreement through the northeast section to complete their site plan." He held Preston's gaze. "Without that agreement, the development contract cannot close. The land value increase you were counting on does not materialize." Preston was very still. "I haven't decided what to do with that request yet," Walter said. "I may grant the corridor agreement. I may not. That decision is entirely mine." He paused once more. "What I am telling you is that the financial outcome you built 4 transactions around depends on a decision I haven't made. And the only thing that influences that decision in any direction is how the next 30 days go for Sylvia." It was not a threat. Walter had been careful about that. Careful in his mind through the 3 minutes he had stood in the hallway, turning the words over the way he turned a piece of wood in his hands before cutting it, checking the grain, checking the line. A threat required something to be forced. This was not forcing. This was accurate information delivered in sequence to a man who had built his entire approach on the assumption that he was the only one who understood the full shape of what he was doing. Preston understood now that he was not.
The divorce, Preston said finally. His voice had the flatness of a man doing arithmetic. Straightforward, clean. Whatever Sylvia's attorney files, you sign. A long silence. The elevator at the end of the hall arrived at their floor. Opened and closed again without anyone getting out.
All right, Preston said.
Walter studied him for a moment. The set of his jaw, the stillness of his hands. He had learned over 40 years to read a man's word by the way his body held it. Preston was not relieved. He was not grateful. He was calculating, which was what Preston always did, and what he would probably always do. But the calculation had landed in the right place, and that was sufficient.
One more thing, Walter said.
Sylvia doesn't hear about this conversation. Not from you. Not from anyone.
Agreed, Preston said.
Walter nodded once. He turned and walked back toward Mediation Room B without looking back. Behind him, he heard Preston's footsteps moving in the other direction, toward the elevator. Norris was standing at the door of the mediation room, with his briefcase in his hand, and the particular expression of a man who had decided not to ask questions he did not strictly need the answers to.
Ready, Norris said. Ready, Walter said.
They walked to the elevator together. Walter pressed the button for the lobby and stood quietly while the floors descended. He did not feel triumphant. He felt the way he felt at the end of a long and careful piece of work. Not exhilarated, but settled. The particular satisfaction of a thing finished to the standard it deserved.
The lobby doors opened, and they walked out into the December afternoon.
They drove back to the farm in separate cars. Walter arrived first and sat in the truck in the driveway for a moment before going inside. The afternoon was clear and cold, the kind of December day that had no weather in it, just light and stillness, and the particular quality of air that came after something had concluded.
Sylvia pulled in 10 minutes later.
She had been somewhere in between, not at the farm, not at the house she shared with Preston. Walter did not ask where. He got out of the truck, and she got out of her car, and they stood in the driveway for a moment, the way people stood when the words had not yet arranged themselves into the right order.
You hungry? Walter asked.
Not really, she said. But I'll sit with you. He made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Walter had eaten breakfast every morning for 31 years. Where Sylvia had done homework as a child, and argued with Margaret about curfew as a teenager. And cried quietly the morning after the funeral while Walter made eggs. And neither of them spoke. The table held all of that, the way old furniture held things not visibly, but present in the grain of it. Sylvia wrapped her hands around her mug. When did you know? She asked. Actually know, not suspect. 14 months ago, Walter said. I overheard a phone call. Preston was in the driveway. He didn't see me in the workshop.
What did he say?
Enough! Walter looked at his coffee. He was talking about a timeline, about the property, about what he expected to get out of the mediation. Sylvia was quiet. She turned her mug slowly on the table, a small rotation, the way she had always moved things when she was thinking. You let it go 14 months, she said. Not accusatory, trying to understand the shape of it. I needed to do it right, Walter said. And I needed you to see it, without me standing in front of it, telling you what to see. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a hard thing to ask someone to do without telling them you're asking. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to think it was the right call. I'm telling you why I made it. She nodded slowly and looked back at her mug. Outside, the afternoon light was dropping toward the tree line. The north field was pale gold in the late sun, the winter rye holding its color all the way to the fence line. Catherine thinks the divorce will take 3 months, Sylvia said, if he doesn't contest anything. He won't, Walter said. She looked at him. He held her gaze without explaining further, and after a moment, she let it go the same way she had always let certain things go with him. understanding that there were parts of a decision that belonged to the person who made it and did not require full disclosure to be trusted.
Mom would have known what to say right now, Sylvia said.
She always did, Walter said. He stood and went to the shelf above the counter, the one with the cookbooks and the old tin box where Margaret had kept rubber bands and spare buttons, and took down the envelope. He had brought it in from the workshop that morning before driving to Charleston. He had known, in the way he sometimes knew things without being able to explain the knowing, that today was the day it needed to move from the shelf to the table. He said it in front of Sylvia. She looked at it, at Margaret's handwriting on the front, her mother's particular script, the letters close together, the capital S with its small upward curl.
When did she write this?
Sylvia asked. I found it after the funeral, in her address book. I don't know when she wrote it. He sat back down. I haven't read it. Sylvia looked up at him. You haven't read it? No. 4 to 3 years. Yes. She looked at the envelope for a long time. Then she slid it back across the table toward him. Then you should read it first, she said. It's yours. Walter looked at the envelope. His name in Margaret's handwriting. The unsealed flap. He picked it up and opened it the way he had been avoiding opening it for 3 years. Not carefully, not ceremonially, just directly. The way you finally did a thing when the time for it had arrived and there was nothing left to wait for. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on the notepaper Margaret had kept in the desk drawer. Her handwriting was even and clear, the way it always was, without the tremor he had expected and feared. He read it. The kitchen was quiet. Sylvia watched his face, and he let her because whatever she saw there was honest, and he had nothing left to manage for the day. When he finished, he set the pages flat on the table and sat with them for a moment. She knew, he said. Knew what? He slid the letter across to Sylvia. She knew about Preston. Not the details, not the fraud or any of that. But she knew his character. He paused. She wrote this 14 months before she died. She said she was writing it because she wanted you to have your father's full attention when the time came. She said she trusted me to know when that was. Sylvia picked up the letter. She read it slowly. Walter watched the afternoon light move across the kitchen table and said nothing. Some things needed the room they needed. When she finished, she set the letter down. Her eyes were wet, but she did not look away.
She gave you permission,
Sylvia said quietly. Yes, Walter said. She did. They sat together in the kitchen as the light went gold and then gray outside the window, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else for a while. Judge Calhoun arrived at 5:30 with a bottle of bourbon and 3 glasses, because Elias Calhoun always knew when to show up and always knew what to bring. He poured without asking, and they sat on the porch as the December dark came in across the field. Nobody needed to say much. They had earned the quiet. Walter was in the workshop at 6 on a Friday morning, 10 days after the mediation. The farm was quiet in the way it only got in deep December. The birds gone south, the creek running low, the fields holding their frost until mid-morning. He had the wood stove going in the corner and the single overhead light on, and the door cracked 2 inches for the air circulation the finish needed. The oak box was on the bench in front of him. He had started it 3 weeks before the mediation, working on it in the early morning hours, when the rest of the project, the legal preparation, the waiting, the management of sequence and timing, had filled the daylight hours completely. The box had been the thing he could control entirely. Dimensions, joinery, finish. No attorneys, no filings, no variables outside his own hands. It was small, 12 inches long, 7 wide, 4 deep. White oak, quarter sawn, with a grain pattern that ran clean and uninterrupted across the lid and both long sides. The joinery was hand-cut dovetails at all 4 corners, the kind of joint that required no fasteners and held by geometry alone. The lid fit on a pair of small brass hinges he had ordered from a supplier in Virginia who made hardware the old way, by hand, to measurements that had not changed in 100 years. He had not decided what the box was for when he started it. That was not unusual. Some of his best pieces had begun that way, the material suggesting a form, the form suggesting a purpose, the purpose arriving late and always at the right time. He knew now what it was for. He opened the lid and looked inside. He had lined the interior with a piece of cream-colored linen that Margaret had kept in the fabric drawer in the sewing room, a remnant from something she had made years ago, soft, and even the kind of material that held things gently. He had cut it to fit and pressed it in with hide glue along the edges, leaving the center loose so items placed inside would rest on the fabric rather than on wood. He picked up Margaret's letter from the corner of the bench, where it had been sitting since the night Sylvia had brought it back to him, folded back into its envelope, his name in Margaret's script facing up. He held it for a moment. 2 pages, handwritten, 14 months before she died. She had known things that should have been impossible to know, in the way that people who paid close attention to the people they loved sometimes knew things before the evidence fully assembled itself. She had trusted him to act when it was time. He had. He placed the envelope in the box and set it against the left side of the linen interior. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and removed the small piece of paper he had torn from his notebook 14 months ago. The 2-column list he had made the night he overheard Preston in the driveway. What I know on one side, what I need on the other. He had crossed off every item on both columns over the course of 14 months, one by one, as each element of the situation resolved itself. The paper was soft at the fold lines from being carried in his pocket, then in the notebook, then in the drawer beside his bed. He placed it in the box beside the envelope. He closed the lid and ran his thumb along the dovetail joint at the near corner. Clean. No gap, no flex, no movement. The geometry was doing what geometry did when you cut it correctly, holding everything together without being asked to work hard. Walter carried the box to the workshop door and looked out at the farm. The frost was still on the north field, white and even in the early light. The winter rye stood in its rows beneath it, green underneath the white, patient and unhurried in the way of things that grow slowly and hold what they grow toward. The oak on the east fence line was bare now, its canopy stripped down to the essential structure, the main limbs, the secondary branches, the logic of the thing visible in a way it wasn't in full leaf. You could see in winter how an oak was actually built, where the weight was carried, what had been there from the beginning and what had come later. He had planted that tree with Margaret 34 years ago. It was still there. He heard Sylvia's car in the drive before he saw it. The particular sound of her engine on the gravel. Familiar. The way all the sounds of the farm were familiar. Categorized without effort into the inventory of things that belonged here. She parked and came across the yard toward the workshop, hands in her jacket pockets, breath visible in the cold air. She stopped at the door. "You're up early," she said. "Always," he said. She looked at the box in his hands. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of seeing a thing fully before she spoke about it. "Is that for me?" she asked. "Yes," he said. He held it out and she took it. She turned it in her hands the way he had taught her to handle finished work, slowly, looking at every surface, feeling the joinery at the corners. She lifted the lid and looked inside, at the envelope and the folded paper resting on the cream linen. She closed the lid gently. "What do I do with it?" she asked. "Keep it," Walter said. "That's all. Just keep it." She nodded and held the box against her chest with both hands, the way you carried something you had decided mattered. They stood together in the workshop doorway for a moment, looking out at the farm, the frost on the field, the bare oak on the east line, the sky going from gray to pale gold above the tree line, as the morning came fully in.
Walter thought about his father's hands on a piece of wood, showing him how to read the grain. About Margaret kneeling in the spring dirt beside a sapling that would spend 34 years becoming something neither of them would fully see. About Norris saying, "You should have been a lawyer," and Walter saying, "My father thought it was honest work that built things." It was. It still was.
He reached up and turned off the workshop light.
"Come on," he said. "I'll make breakfast."
They walked across the yard together in the December morning, the frost crunching lightly under their boots, the farm quiet and whole around them.
The land remembered. So did he.
Walter never raised his voice, and he never raised his hand. He read the grain, trusted the truth, and let the Lord handle the rest. Romans chapter 12, verse 19. "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." Tell me in the comments, could you have stayed silent for 14 months to protect your child? If this story spoke to you, subscribe to MaleRevenge and share it with a friend who believes in quiet strength. God bless you, and good night.